I was captured by Nazi forces and locked in a sealed, pitch-black room for days.
No sound, no light. Then, suddenly, brutal sounds.
A soldier woke up to the smell of burning flesh. Not someone else's, his own. There was still a length of copper wire being pulled out of the center of his left palm, leaving behind a deep cavity as if someone had just carved a letter into him. 3 men stood in the room, none of them wearing a standard German uniform. They didn't ask questions. They just watched and prepared to heat the metal again. This wasn't an interrogation. It was a ritual stretched over 7 days, and he was the offering. When American soldiers were captured during World War II, the first thing they thought of was the Geneva Convention. The second was the hope of being treated as a lawful combatant. But in the hands of the Gestapo or Waffen-SS, such hopes dissolved instantly. Those captured after their planes were shot down, or paratroopers who landed in occupied territory, or anyone mistaken for a spy, they were no longer soldiers. They became experiments, tests of endurance, of silence, of despair. Official history calls them prisoners of war. But what they went through wasn't imprisonment, it was destruction. No firing squads, no mass graves, just wires, burning metal, screaming voices echoing down concrete hallways, and nameless rooms buried beneath the earth. And all that remains today are the stories of a few who survived. Men who still flinch at night when the smell of heated metal drifts from a kitchen stove in peacetime America. These are the 7 most brutal methods of torture ever inflicted on American soldiers by Nazi Germany, not in the trenches, but in the dark. They are not part of the curriculum. They are not featured in war films, and they are not something America has ever been comfortable remembering. There's a form of torture that doesn't require touching the body. No whips, no fire, no visible marks. It leaves no bruises, but it can make a man forget his own name. In certain secret Gestapo interrogation sites, especially for captured American pilots suspected of reconnaissance missions, one particular method was favored: sensory isolation through sound. The room had no windows, no clock, no natural sounds, only hidden speakers embedded in the walls and floor, broadcasting short looping audio segments, crying infants, moaning women, banging doors, and distorted screams that sounded like they were coming from underground. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, sometimes once every second, sometimes in rapid bursts like seizures. Even the floor vibrated subtly in timed intervals, just enough to make the body lose balance without falling, enough to confuse the brain into forgetting whether it was standing still or floating. The standard confinement lasted 24 to 48 hours. No beatings, no questions, no interrogation, only sound and light. The results were unmistakable. Some prisoners, upon release, started muttering in German despite never learning it. Others couldn't recognize their interrogators. One, Lieutenant James A. Morgan, lost control of his own behavior. He began banging his head against the wall, convinced someone was peeling his scalp from the inside. The method was known as full sensory disruption. It wasn't designed to extract information, but to sever the last connection between man and reality. When a prisoner no longer knows what's real and what's not, the next step is simple. Ask a question and let them answer themselves.
It wasn't just pain. It was the way they looked at you, like you weren't human anymore. They didn't touch me, not that day. Just took me outside and pulled a bag over my head.
A soldier can be trained to endure pain. He might grit his teeth through beatings, withstand burns, survive electric shocks without speaking. But no one is trained to die. And worse still, no one knows how to react when death comes, but doesn't. In the Gestapo's detention camps, one of the most effective forms of psychological torture was the mock execution, a direct strike at the core of human survival instinct, carefully staged to make a man break without ever being touched. It usually happened after several days of captivity, when the prisoners' statements didn't line up, or when silence lasted too long. They were pulled from their cell and led to an empty yard behind the compound. No one told them what was happening. A black bag was pulled over their head, or their eyes were blindfolded. They heard boots moving around them. Someone gripped their shoulders. Metal clicked behind the neck. Sometimes an order was shouted in German. Often there was nothing at all. Just a long pause. And then a single gunshot, deafening, fired inches from the skull, deliberately aimed away. No two men reacted the same. Some collapsed. Some soiled themselves. Others screamed uncontrollably. And in many cases, just minutes after the execution failed, the interrogator would step into the room, sit calmly across from the prisoner, and ask the same questions again, this time receiving longer, confused, increasingly inconsistent answers. No instruments, no wounds. But the effect lasted for weeks. An American paratrooper named Albert Nolan once recalled, "I didn't know why I was still alive. But after that, I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I started answering questions they hadn't even asked yet." Records from Zossen camp document over 20 cases of this method. All of them led to altered testimonies within 48 hours. Mock execution was the fastest way to plant death inside a living brain. And when a man believes he's already died, resistance becomes nothing more than a rehearsal for something that will never come.
They didn't need machines, just heat. They stuck a knife in the coals until it glowed, bright orange, like the sun.
Not every prison camp had electricity. Not every captured soldier was important enough to face sonic disruption or mock executions. But a coal stove, a copper wire, or a field knife, those were always available. In local holding stations operated by Waffen-SS or auxiliary units, one of the most common methods of torture was crude and devastating, heating metal until it glowed red and pressing it straight into living flesh. The process was simple. A standard combat knife, usually 6 inches long with a broad blade and a blood groove, was placed directly into open flame or heated on burning coals until it radiated orange. Some camps used coiled copper wire or bent iron rods instead. Once the metal was hot enough, 2 guards would restrain the prisoner, either face down with a bare back or facing up depending on the intended area. There was no anesthesia, no numbing agents. The point wasn't to kill, it was to inflict pain slowly and precisely in ways that broke the mind while keeping the body alive. Burns were targeted to areas dense with nerves and low in muscle, wrists, toes, the groin, inner arms. Sometimes the chest, especially if the prisoner was a pilot, as a punishment for bombing civilians. Records from Koblenz camp detail how SS guards often branded prisoners with red-hot symbols or spiral-shaped wires, literally stamping their skin with heat. One airman, John D. McAllister, testified that he was marked with a V-shaped burn on his right shoulder after refusing to reveal the coordinates of an American airbase in Britain. No one passed out immediately. On the contrary, the heightened nerve response made every second feel like fire crawling under the skin, accompanied by the smell of burning flesh and the sound of blistering skin popping like oil. Some prisoners tried not to scream, but their eyes welled up and urine leaked down their legs. Others thrashed until they dislocated a shoulder. Some bit through their own tongue. After 3 or 4 sessions, most no longer spoke in full sentences. When confessions came, they were choked, trembling, and broken, spoken through eyes that couldn't hold a stare. The red-hot knife wasn't a tool. It was a message, a way for the SS to say, "No one's coming. You'll be burned inch by inch until the only thing keeping you alive is the truth."
It wasn't the dark that broke me. It was the silence.
No bruises, no ropes, no fire. Yet this was one of the most devastating forms of torture inflicted on American soldiers. Total isolation. Not just a dark cell, but a stone pit, buried deep underground, stripped of light, sound, smell, and time. A space designed to suffocate consciousness, minute by minute. Prisoners were stripped down to a thin pair of shorts, then led into a double-sealed steel door. Once shut, the room made no echo. Nothing but the sound of one's own heartbeat and breath growing thicker in the cold, dense air. At Hammelburg, there were at least 3 isolation chambers like this, each over 30 feet deep, just slightly wider than a coffin, and tall enough to sit, but not stand. That's when the psychological decomposition began. There were no scheduled meals, no voices, no light to mark day from night. After 24 hours, cognitive disorientation set in. After 48 hours, most prisoners couldn't tell where they were. Some began hearing whispers. Others believed they were already dead and awaiting burial. One soldier, Charles H. Ellington, was left in one such pit for 5 days. When pulled out, he no longer knew his name, couldn't recall his unit, didn't recognize the American soldiers who rescued him. In the official report, the military physician wrote, "He responded like a child and asked me if I was God." No beatings were necessary, yet this method left a deeper scar than any whip, one that tore from the inside out. By the time they were brought back to interrogation, most didn't need to be questioned. They spoke on their own, sentence by sentence, as if their minds had collapsed just to be heard. Total isolation didn't use violence. It simply took away everything that made a man feel human.
They didn't want answers. They wanted revenge. Dragged me through the streets. Cut, spit on.
This wasn't interrogation, and it wasn't about information. It was revenge, public, emotional, and brutal, inflicted when a downed American pilot was captured after bombing raids that killed German civilians. Sometimes, instead of being sent directly to a prison camp, the captured airman was dragged through local villages into the very streets where people had just lost homes, children, and entire families. They didn't kill him right away. First, they humiliated. The prisoner's hands were bound. He was dragged across cobblestone, spat on, doused with dirty water. His clothes were torn. His head was shaved or carved with a knife. Reports from Aachen in 1944 describe how one American pilot was slashed across the chest with a razor blade, his skin cut into a crude cross, after his B-17 went down in a raid that killed over 70 civilians. He was forced to stand in the town square. Children's bodies lay nearby, still unburied. A piece of blood-soaked uniform clung to the deep wound on his shoulder. One SS officer, instead of asking questions, simply said, "You are their gift." Villagers struck him with metal rods. An old woman slapped him hard enough to draw blood. But the most terrifying part was the silence. No one stopped it. No one intervened. Charles Meyer, a young soldier who survived and was later exchanged, recalled, "They scooped the skin off my shoulder with a soup spoon, not to kill me, just to show the crowd I was still alive." This wasn't war between soldiers. It was ritual humiliation, an execution of the soul, conducted by civilians too shattered to fight back and too broken to forgive. The prisoner wasn't seen as human anymore. He became a symbol of fire from above, of voices that never came back, of homes turned to ash. If the pilot survived, he'd be sent to camp afterward. But something in him stayed broken, physically wounded, mentally splintered, and often unable to remember or bear to speak of what had truly happened.
They didn't beat me. Just handed me a cup and told me to drink.
Some of Nazi Germany's most disturbing methods didn't involve whips, electric cords, or hot irons. Sometimes it came in a simple tin cup, one that a prisoner wasn't allowed to refuse. In the late years of the war, when Germany's collapse began to show itself on the battlefield maps, certain Gestapo outposts and SS medical units began conducting hasty human trials on captured American airmen, mostly those shot down during night bombing raids. The goal wasn't interrogation, it was observation. These men were test subjects, forced to ingest chemicals never tested on humans before. James Atkinson, a pilot from Texas who was captured near Hamburg, recalled, "They led me into a room, unusually clean. 2 men in white coats stood waiting. They didn't beat me. They didn't shout. They handed me a cup of water and ordered me to drink it." Within 30 minutes, his body began to overheat. His vision blurred, sounds fragmented into dozens of layers, and the walls, he claimed, began to breathe. James lost all sense of what was real. Another soldier testified that he hallucinated for 2 days, convinced he was burning his own mother alive. The exact compound used was never confirmed. Some post-war sources suspect it was a precursor to LSD, diluted with diuretics and small doses of amphetamines. The goal was to overload the nervous system, trigger a psychological collapse, and quietly observe what remained of a man's mind under pressure. No questions were asked. No answers were expected. The prisoner would scream, claw, sometimes bash his head against the walls, and no one intervened. One American was found with torn fingernails, bleeding from his ears, muttering, "The child in the wall is watching me." There were no cameras, just notebooks, and men in white coats who were not doctors. Of all the tortures inflicted on Americans by the Nazi regime, this was perhaps the only one that left no scars on the outside. But it did something worse. It hollowed the mind, leaving behind voices that never stopped whispering and memories that fractured every night into something unrecognizable.
They didn't beat me. Didn't yell. Just told me to take my clothes off.
Not all battles are fought with bullets. Some only require wind, ice, and a silence so deep it numbs the soul. On the Western Front, especially in the Ardennes, where temperatures could drop below -20 degrees Celsius, captured American soldiers were subjected to a form of torture they never expected, being stripped naked and left in the snow. No wires, no screams, just a thin pair of underwear and an endless stretch of white. SS guards often used this method on prisoners deemed uncooperative, or simply as a form of punishment. Prisoners were dragged from their barracks, forced to strip, and made to stand barefoot on snow-covered ground for 5 to 10 minutes, long enough for the burning sensation in their limbs to turn to numbness, then to pain as sharp as needles. Some were forced to kneel or lie face down in the snow, while German soldiers stood watching, smoking cigarettes. No beatings, no orders, no threats. And that silence, that cold, calculated detachment, was what made the fear sink deeper. James Lowell, an American artilleryman captured near Bastogne, later testified that after 6 minutes lying on the ice, he completely lost sensation in his hands. A day later, the camp doctor had to amputate the tip of his right pinky due to necrosis. Those who didn't collapse from the cold immediately often broke down afterward due to thermal shock. Prisoners brought back into warmer cells entered states of delirium and panic. Some shouted for their mothers. Others tried to leap from windows, believing they were swimming across rivers. This method wasn't designed to extract confessions. It was a cruel game with the human body, seeing how long it could last against wind, frost, and cruelty. The Germans didn't need to lift a finger. Nature would take care of the rest. And that, something invisible, something no man could fight, made this one of the most haunting, bone-deep nightmares to linger in the minds of those who lived through it. World War II ended in victory, but not everyone came home as victors. For thousands of American soldiers who were captured by the Nazis, Liberation Day marked the start of a new war, one without bullets or bombs, but just as cruel. A war against memory, against sleepless nights, panic without cause, and the quiet suspicion in the eyes of their own families. They had been tortured by fire, by electricity, by the cold, and by silence. stripped of not just clothing, but dignity, treated not as prisoners of war, but as experiments, as outlets for vengeance, as objects. That wasn't war. That was cruelty, systematic, calculated, and carried out by men in uniform who had chosen to abandon their humanity. We, as Americans, have always taken pride in our soldiers' courage. But few know that when the war was over, many of them couldn't find work, couldn't hold their own children without flinching, couldn't sleep without screaming. The government didn't ask enough, the press didn't report enough. And for decades, the world seemed eager to remember the victory, but not the tortures that were quietly buried behind Gestapo doors. Yes, war crimes were prosecuted at Nuremberg, but not all torturers were brought to light, and not every wound was written down. Today, when people speak of Nazi atrocities, they think of concentration camps. But beyond the barbed wire, there were cold stone rooms, live wires, snow fields where American prisoners were stripped and left to freeze, not for information, but for revenge. We must remember, not just to honor the fallen, but to acknowledge those who survived, in silence, in shadows, because a victory that forgets its survivors was never complete.